Okay, good evening everybody and welcome. For those who don't know my name, I'm Dr. Lucy Meredith. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at UWS. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Paisley campus this evening for our Principal and Vice-Chancellor, Professor James Miller's inaugural lecture, where he will discuss the lessons he's learned, and I'm sure there are plenty of them, from his extensive experience of leadership over the years, both in higher education and also the healthcare sectors. As many of you know, Professor Miller joined UWS in November 2022 and since then has been driving forward our ambitious strategic vision for the university while ensuring we provide a fantastic experience for our amazing students. Professor Miller is a prominent academic and higher education leader, and it is an absolute pleasure to work alongside him, as his extensive experience and values are very much aligned with the values and vision of UWS. I'm sure you, like me, are very much looking forward to listening to Professor Miller's lecture. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the floor Professor James Miller to deliver his inaugural lecture. Have a fantastic evening, everyone, and enjoy.
Well, good evening, everyone, and can I add my welcome to you all to that of Lucy's. It's a great pleasure to see so many friends and family and colleagues from my past lives here this evening. So, without further ado, we will make a start. Now, on your seat, unless you've given it away to somebody, you should have been given a plain piece of paper. So if you haven't got one, then wave your hand and somebody will get one to you. So there's 3 down at the front here. Thank you very much. And it would be 3 from the family, wouldn't it? I mean, really, that just demonstrates that this has not been rehearsed. So what I want you to do with this pristine piece of A4 paper is to simply crumple it up. Just crumple it up and keep a hold of it. And we will come back to that at the end of the session. So, without further ado, let's really make a start. And I want to start by addressing this whole issue of whether or not the lecture is dead. It has been a bit of a debate, probably pre-COVID, but certainly during and after COVID. And I am not one of the advocates that the lecture is dead. I think it's very much alive. Either that, or we just have to go home now. But actually, for me, I don't think it's dead. What I hope is dead, however, is that event that used to be described as a set of facts that was transferred from the notes of the lecturer to the notes of the student without passing through the brains of either. Now, I hope that is dead, and I hope actually that died quite a long time ago, because this chap here looks as if he's expired already. So, the lecture, in my view, is very much alive. It's just not what it used to be. When we begin to teach people about how to teach, one of the first things that we get them to think about is starting from where the student is. It's not the best grammar, but it's a good starting point. So everybody in this room is in a different starting point when it comes to me. So I'm going to spend about 90 seconds just getting you all up to a similar kind of place as to where I am. So, oh yes, go on. So the reason that I put this picture up was in a previous role, we played that game, Who's Baby? Who is the baby? And this was my entry into it. And one of my colleagues at the time, who I could hear from afar, I heard her saying, well, that's James, because he looks like a boss with his wee dungarees on. I was standing right behind her, which she didn't know. But anyway, so this is me at a very early age. There is only one person in the room who would recognise me from this picture, and that is one of my primary school teachers. And I would point out she was 14 at the time when she started the class, and we were her first class as a qualified teacher. It's not hard to pick me out in this particular picture, but this is when I qualified as a registered general nurse in Edinburgh in 1986. And it was 3 years of great experience, because we were actually employees of the health board. So when we talk about graduate apprenticeships now, there's nothing new in the world, because essentially that's what we were. But we did not finish up with a degree, as I'll come on to discuss just in a second. But this was a great time, and I thoroughly enjoyed all of this experience. This was when I graduated from what was Dundee Institute of Technology and is now Abertay University. And this was a part-time degree, and the reason why I did it there was because at the time, that was the only university in Scotland that was offering part-time degrees to qualified nurses. And there was no such thing as recognition of prior learning at that point. So we went back to the beginning. So this was 5 years of travelling between Edinburgh and Dundee on a weekly basis, plus 2 weeks of block at the end of every year, which was done whilst working full-time, studying part-time. I then went on to do my Masters at Edinburgh and Napier University, and I went on to do my PhD at Edinburgh University, all part-time. So all of my educational experience has been part-time. I was also first in family to go to university. So I feel a lot of empathy with the students, many of the students that we have here at UWS. I understand the roles that they are going through. What a magnificent mop of black hair, don't you think? Sadly, by the time we get to this, it's all kind of gone. So what I really want us to be thinking about, or what I'm going to perhaps walk you through, are some of the things that I've learned during these various phases of my career to date. So my first lesson is around recognising when you are actually leading. And this is me as my first ever staff nurse's role. Again, probably not that difficult to pick me out. That's me there. In the surgical unit at the Western General Hospital in Edinburgh. That is probably late 1986 at this point. And the issue that we had in those days, it makes me feel really old actually to say that, but one day you were a student nurse, and the next day, you were a staff nurse and you were a qualified nurse. And you were almost expected to suddenly have this switch turned, that you were moving from being a learner to someone who knew everything. Now, you never felt that, but people round about you absolutely did. And we were never really taught as senior students that the role that we would play in those early days was actually a leadership role. You were taught how to organise things, but you were never really taught about being a leader. And you quite quickly found that you were leading a clinical team, even if it was for a relatively short period of time, and you developed the skills that needed to go round about that. So this was very early days, very formative in terms of developing my leadership style and approach. And one of the things, this paper here was the first paper that I had published. And it was in 1988, so I wasn't even 2 years qualified at this point. Now, you won't find this paper in a learned research journal. It's not a refable paper, and if Milan were here, I'd have to calm him down, because it's not. But what it was, so it's a fairly straightforward, well, it is a clinical procedure where you're measuring and recording central venous pressure, which tells clinicians how well or poorly a patient is hydrated. And it's actually quite a complex piece of measurement. And it was being done in a whole variety of ways. And it used to drive me nuts, because we were recording data and clinical decisions were being made, sometimes on the decision of what might actually be quite dodgy measurements. So I felt there was a real need to make sure and to take a lead role in making sure everybody knew how to complete this procedure properly. So I had a bit of a tutorial in the clinical area and then wrote it up in this paper, which was very well received and in actual fact was used then as part of the procedure manual throughout the hospital. So recognising even at that early stage, although we were not holding proper, as you might imagine, leadership roles, you were in fact taking a leadership role, albeit in quite an informal way. So that really was my sort of early lessons. Everybody will recognise this. Everybody thinks that every day is a school day, which of course it is. And I want to just talk you through what some of that actually meant for me. There we go. So some of the nurses of my generation might recognise this lady. This is Dr. Margaret Auld, who was the Chief Nursing Officer for Scotland when I qualified when I was training and qualified. This is her receiving her honorary degree at Queen Margaret University. And she was, I think, probably one of the last Chief Nursing Officers for Scotland who did not get embroiled in being a civil servant in the Home and what was then the Home and Health Department. So she really was an extremely strong advocate, not only for the nursing profession, but for patients and the work that the nursing profession undertook. And I always had great admiration for her. She really was that great advocate for the profession. Let me introduce you to Sister Jeffrey. Now, Sister Jeffrey is here for a variety of reasons. First of all, she was formidable. And you've probably all come across formidable sisters, and the archetypal matron stroke ward sister that you would see in some of the Carry On films is not a million miles away from this. And don't kid me on that you haven't seen them, because I know that you will have. But from her point of view, patient care and the standards of patient care was absolutely paramount in everything that was undertaken. At that time, we used to be organised under a system called task allocation. So everybody was given a task to do, and you did it for every patient. We kind of moved on from that and looked after patients much more holistically. But when she was allocating the tasks, she was on your back all the time, and you jolly well made sure that it was done. Part of the reason that she's here is actually, for some reason, I don't actually know why, she's the only one who I've got a picture of. So she's here representing all of the fabulous and amazing ward sisters that I encountered in my time in clinical practice. This chap was the first ever chief executive that I really worked very closely with, and I've got some colleagues in the audience who worked with him as well. Sadly, Paul died at the very young age of 55 while out doing a bit of hill walking. But watching him as a leader was incredibly instructive. He was the first one that I knew who would wander around the hospital on a regular basis. He would often be seen in the dining room having lunch with the porters, finding out what was going on in the hospital. And he had two battle cries, really. One was always, assume nothing. Doesn't matter what you're thinking or what you're doing, assume nothing and check it out. And it's something that has stayed with me. The second thing was he would charge you £1 if you misspelt ophthalmology. And believe you me, you only did it once. And I fell into that trap. I did, in fact, spell ophthalmology incorrectly. It's O-P-H-T-H, just in case you're ever caught. So Paul was the first chief executive that I worked with. Martin Bean was the first Vice-Chancellor that I ever worked with, and he was the Vice-Chancellor at the Open University. He, like me, did not grow up coming through the ranks of a university, but he also understood the benefits and the value of and the impact that higher education has, not just on the individual, but on society. And he very much drove the Open University in that way, Martin himself, as you can probably just slightly tell from this photograph, did have a physical disability, but it never got in the way of anything that he did, and it was always part and parcel of his personality. He had a great ability to get a room, and it didn't really matter who was in the room, really fired up about what it was he was talking about, whether that was, a group of senior managers all facing in the right direction, or trying to persuade a group of politicians and civil servants to change their mind about something. But he had that charisma, he had that ability to really influence people. This next one is what is commonly known as a twofer. So both of these individuals I have worked with. Pamela on your left, Pamela Gillis, was the Principal and Vice-Chancellor at Glasgow Caledonian University, where I was the Deputy. Professor Brian Williams, who is on the right here, was the President of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow when I was the Chief Executive. And he's in the audience, so you can find him later. So two very, again, charismatic leaders, very different styles, in very different positions. Pamela, who had a line management position, obviously in a university, had a different kind of charisma, and again, not dissimilar to Martin in a number of ways, was able to get people into her way of thinking. When Brian was the president, he had to influence, I think at the time there must have been about 13 or 14 other medical royal colleges in and around the United Kingdom, who used to get together in a variety of guises. And of course, at that time, they were all, and they still are, all independent bodies. So there was no legitimate power of one over the other. So your ability to persuade and change minds and so on needed a different approach. And watching Brian doing that was an absolute masterclass in how he was able to really cajole people along, really use evidence for the basis of decision making. And if all of that failed, he would just crack a joke. He was affectionately known as the Chick Murray of the Royal Colleges in the United Kingdom. So all of these people have played an influential role, and from all of them, I have learned something very different about how to be a leader, the situations that you find yourself in, the approaches that you will ultimately take. Sticking with the theme of learning lessons, I'm often struck by the fact that many things talk about, or many reports talk about lessons learned or learning lessons. And what is obvious to me is that lessons are often identified, not often learned. These two reports are 7 years apart, and they're both related to midwifery services. The Kirkup report in 2015 and the Ockenden report in 2022. You could almost take the conclusions and recommendations from both these reports and swap them over, and it would make absolutely no difference to the body of the text. So when we talk about lessons learned, let's be clear that we really are talking about lessons learned, not lessons identified. And the same thing happened with this report, which is the Francis report into what happened in mid-Staffordshire. And the common theme around all of these is about failures in communication, it's about failures of agencies, but it's also about failures in leadership as well. And I fear that we're not always, as I've just outlined, learning the lessons. We might be identifying them, but are we really learning them? And perhaps most tragically, some people might remember this little girl. This is Victoria Climby, and she died on the 25th of February 2000, and the report into her death came out about a year to 18 months later. So let's say year 2000, 2001, 20 plus years ago. How many children's deaths have we heard about through the media as a result of failures? Every single one of them talk about lessons learned. Lessons identified is not the same as lessons learned. And part of the reason for that, I think, is identified by this woman. It's a woman called Margaret Heffernan. And if you ever get the chance to go and have a look at her TED talk, I'd thoroughly recommend it. Because what she talks about in her book is willful blindness. Things that go on in organisations. And she talks about many organisations. This is not about one sector or another, where people willfully do not see what is obviously in front of them and do something about it. And for me, those lessons that we talked about earlier are part of the problem that she's identifying of individuals not taking responsibility and accountability and making sure lessons are learned and things are done differently. Thoroughly recommend her TED talk. Moving on, 3, the importance of networks is something that I think, again, no matter what sector you're in, you will appreciate and understand. There's no point in looking for me in this picture, I'm not in it. But this is a celebration of the 50th cohort of the top management programme for higher education in the United Kingdom. So that's 50 cohorts of about 20 to 25 who've been through this particular programme. And it was a fantastic experience from the point of view of networking, because they came from all over the United Kingdom. So even although we are sometimes a little parochial in Scotland, Wales and Ireland, actually the mix worked extremely well. And you developed your network right across the United Kingdom. And right from the first cohort up to the 50th, people are still in touch. People are still having reunions of the cohorts that they have gone through. So the development of a network and using your network for your own development, for your own development of your leadership style is really important. You also have to do that on an international scale as well. Now, this will be a bit like finding Wally or finding the Wally, but I am in this picture. And so there I am there. So this is the cohort of scholars that I was with in Harvard. This is at the Institute of Education Management, which was a program that was run from Harvard. Again, you can see a big group. There were quite a considerable number of Americans, not surprisingly, but there were a few Europeans and a couple of British as well. So what that has allowed is to develop your network, for me to develop my network in a much broader way and at an international scale. This chap here was the course leader, a chap called Jim Honan, who was an avid whiskey fan. So as soon as I arrived, he was picking my brains about malt whiskey, of course, which I know absolutely nothing. Individuals and working with individuals who influence our thinking and influencing the way in which we might approach our leadership style is also really important. I had the great good fortune of doing quite a lot of work with Sir Alex Ferguson, who was the founder or founding donor at the foundation in Glasgow Caledonian University. On the far left there is Gillian Watt, who was the director at the time. And I arrived at GCU in 2015. And one of the first jobs I was given was to go down to Manchester with Gillian to speak to Sir Alex about closing the deal around a fairly major donation that he was giving. And I said, I couldn't possibly do that. I couldn't possibly do it. I know nothing about football. If he starts talking to me about football, I'm lost. No, it will be fine. It will be fine. So fortunately, I got there. Gillian warmed him up, and I got him onto golf, and football was never raised. So that was fantastic. This is a graduation of the nursing college that was developed by Glasgow Caledonian University in Bangladesh. And the gentleman who's to the left of me as you see the picture is Muhammad Yunus, Nobel laureate, whose life work is about getting rid of poverty, the elimination of poverty. And he came to us and said, look, we've got a real problem in Bangladesh with nurses, the supply of nurses. So this was set up to bring mainly girls to begin with from the poorest communities in Bangladesh to come into Dhaka and be trained as qualified nurses. And that's now been going for 10 or 15 years now. Every single one of them were then scooped up into jobs in hospitals. But what we never really measured objectively really was what was the additional impact that was being had by these girls, because they were largely girls that came along to begin with. Some went back into their communities, and they were then delivering healthcare in their communities. They were economically active. They were ensuring that others were thinking about what their education might be. So the ripple effect of this work has never really been fully analysed. But when you just look at what we were doing, the impact was quite amazing. And Muhammad Yunus has had such an impact on global leaders thinking around a whole variety of topics, but very specifically around poverty. These are some, and the reason I picked these ones is because they've all ended up with different stories attached to them. So your left is Ailish Angelini. This was me presenting Ailish for her honorary degree at the Usher Hall in Edinburgh. Little did I know that a few years later she would become the Chancellor here at UWS. On the far right is Annie Lennox. That's me presenting her with her honorary degree at the Barbican in London. Little did I know that she was then going to become the Chancellor at GCU some years later. And then there's this little group in the middle, and I promise you I'm not photobombing it. I was actually there, up in the corner. I'm not just sticking my head in. And the two people here, the lady in the middle there is Mary McAleese, former President of Ireland. And she was the President, you may remember, who, when the Queen was addressing an Irish audience, gasped audibly when the Queen addressed them in the Irish language. Standing next to her is David Putnam. He was the Chancellor at the Open University when I was there. And a few years later, I was at a relatively small dinner with him and a few others. And it was the 30th anniversary of the showing of the Chariots of Fire. And there was a number of things that came out of that for me. First of all, he was such a fantastic storyteller. He really was. But what he was describing to his fellow dinner guests was the element of chance and what role chance plays in good fortune. So there were three things in particular he picked out. First of all, he was on holiday in the United States. He was living in a friend's apartment. He became ill, and the only books that were in the apartment were sailing books. He's not got the slightest interest in sailing. So he wandered around the flat until he eventually found one book that had nothing to do with sailing, and that was about Eric Liddell. And that was the impetus for him developing the film Chariots of Fire. The second one was around the fact that they did their first day of filming, which was that scene in St Andrews where they're running across the West Sands. Everybody was very delighted with it. They came in to do the filming the next day, and the cameraman said, some sand got into the lens, we'll have to do it all again. So on day one, flat cam, not a breath of wind, nothing. Day two, when they did the filming, do you remember it? Hair going back in the wind, white horses on the sea, very much more dramatic. And that's the scene that you now view when you watch the film. And the third element, he had many more, but I'm picking out these three in particular. And the third element was that at the very end of the film, everything was done, everything was closed down. It was, as they say, in the can. And he was out for a Chinese meal with his wife, and the owner of the restaurant came over, because it was in the days before mobile phones, and said, "Mr. Putnam, there's a phone call for you." And he went to answer the phone, and it was Vangelis. And Vangelis said to him, "We've got to redo the music." And he said, "No, we can't. It's all done." And, no, we've got to redo the music. So Vangelis appears outside this Chinese restaurant in his Rolls Royce. He gets into the back of it, and he puts a tape, do you remember tapes, into his tape player in the back of this Rolls Royce, and listened to what you now hear as the theme tune, the opening theme tune to Chariots of Fire. And they went back and they redubbed it and made sure that that was. When they filmed, or when they showed the film of the 30th anniversary, they played both versions. Now, there were three elements of that. One which might never have happened if he hadn't come across the book. Secondly, you wouldn't have had that dramatic film, that dramatic scene. And thirdly, you probably wouldn't never have remembered the music, because if I asked you all to hum it now, you probably could. So lots of lessons learned as far as that one is concerned. Everybody has seen pictures of Napoleon. Somebody really ought to have advised him about his stance. But anyway, one thing that was perhaps not often known about Napoleon was when he was discussing battle plans with his generals, he had a corporal brushing his boots in the corner. And his job was to listen to what was going on, not really to brush the boots. That was secondary. And when the generals had all gone, he would then ask him, "What did you think? What do you think the troops are going to think about what the generals have been saying?" And that became known as Napoleon's corporal, or Napoleon's corporals. Professor Williams used to have a similar saying, which was, what's the chat in the bazaars? What's the chat in the bazaars? And that was a lesson that, again, I learned really, really early on. And this was one of my Napoleon's corporals, although I really didn't think about her in that way at the time. This is Mrs. Orr, and she was a nursing auxiliary in the second ward where I was a staff nurse. And to this day, I still don't know what Mrs. Orr's first name was. That's how things were in the mid-80s. But Mrs. Orr knew exactly which patients looked as if they were getting a wee bit off and come and tell you. She knew exactly which nurse was getting a bit upset about a particular situation and would come and tell you. She knew exactly which consultants to avoid, and she would come and tell you. So Mrs. Orr was one of for me, one of the Napoleon's corporals. And the lesson really is about making sure that we understand what is happening on the ground and never forgetting that, being part of hearing what is happening, hearing what the effect is, and listening to that coalface feedback. Mentors and coaches are aplenty. I've picked out a few here. There are many more. As I mentioned earlier on, the Sister Jeffrey at the end there represented a whole number of nurses. And if I were to have them all pictured out here, the thing that would strike you the most is the number of coaches and mentors that I had who were all female. Now that's perhaps not so surprising when I grew up in a female-dominated profession. But actually, for me, that was a huge influence. This chap here was Professor Williams' predecessor in the Royal College. And for those of you who are avid Holby City or Casualty fans, when they talk about the Glasgow Coma Scale or GCS, this was the man who invented it. And that was over 40 years ago. And I think I'm right, Brian will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm right in saying it is still the most cited scientific paper in the world. So when we talk about impact, there is an impact. So the influence that coaches and mentors have on us is just immense. This is Indira Nooyi, and now Indira is, or was, the Chief Executive Officer of PepsiCo in the United States. And she wrote her book, My Life in Full, Work, Family and Our Future. And there were many lessons in her book, but the one that she really wanted to bring across was the importance of family and family life. She lives in a multi-generational household. So she lives with her parents and she lives with her children. And she had a very high-powered career, very high-powered job. And then, of course, we'd go home to her multi-generational family. And her mother's advice to her when she got home was, leave your crown in the garage. Leave your crown in the garage. So the issue here was about you have to have people who keep you grounded. And these are the guys that keep me grounded. They do scrub up well, don't they? So far right are my son and daughter with my wife and I, and then on the left with their respective partners. And I'm always very grateful. And you would imagine that I'm never allowed to allow my boots to get too big for me. They're always brought back down, and I'm always kept very, very firmly in my place. And I do think that is a really important part of it. How am I doing for time? Right, I need to move. So the fourth lesson is around never forgetting the core purpose of the organisation and the values that you are in, and make sure that you connect with that regularly. I want you to introduce you to Steve Mannion, who was described by Robert Winston as the Indiana Jones of surgery, because he is a part-time orthopaedic surgeon. He works in Blackpool, but he spends the rest of his time going round to war-torn parts of the world, putting people back together again. I heard him just very recently from the earthquake in Turkey. But you can see this chap here. If you just look at his legs, the chap that's standing next to him, he's got club foot. Now, club foot is normally dealt with in this country by surgery. But surgery in African countries is very risky because of the high risk of infection. And what Steve did, was to take a procedure that had become obsolete during the First World War and recreated it and updated it and applied it in these positions, in these situations in Africa. And it made a huge difference. And I had the great good fortune of going out to Malawi to work with him. And this is Steve on the left, and this is his clinical officer, and that's me on the right, because the clinical officer needed some work to do, and Steve needed some help in theatre. It's quite some time since I had been in theatre, but actually, even though I say it myself, was quite proud of what we managed to achieve. And what I was trying to do here, or in this situation, was to find out the level of knowledge and expertise of his clinical assistant, because that's what he was called. I said, equate it to me in a position in the United Kingdom. Is that a junior house officer? Is it a registrar? And he said to me, he's probably got the equivalent of an O grade in orthopaedics. And he was the only clinician in the village when Steve wasn't there. And some of the cases were really very tragic. So it was great to meet him, and I not only learned a lot from him, but with some of the clinical skills was able to pass on some of that to the clinical team. The next time I saw him was here. And this is in Kelvin Grove Gallery, where we were raising some money to fund some work in Malawi. This was his first time out of Malawi. First time out of the country. And here he was presenting. I think there must have been close to 200 people there presenting the work that they were doing in Malawi. And he was absolutely overwhelmed and overwhelming. The lady to his left is Steve's wife, who is also Malawian. But again, huge, huge influence. This was a place that Steve and I passed when we were moving from the long way up, going into the bush to undertake a clinic. And this is what the sign says. And I just had to take this picture because to be part of and see this significant place where essentially David Livingstone sat with chiefs and made a treaty with them to stop the slave trade. What a historical place to actually be. So purpose and values of the organisations that we are in must never be forgotten, and we must always make sure that we are part of that. I'm passionate about ensuring that the role of this university, and indeed all universities, is about addressing the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And there are 17 of them, and here are ways in which we can address all 17 of them. So that is extremely important. Purpose and values is also embedded within the leadership roles that we play. And this is a model that was developed by a good friend of mine, Dan Bina, who lives in the United States. Dan also worked for PepsiCo, and he's developed this model of purposeful leadership using a 5H model: head, hands, heart, humility, and humanity. He's actually added a couple of more H's onto it as well, but you get the issue that he is developing here around purposeful leadership. What I don't want you to do is to think that I've had some charmed life and that everybody I've ever met has just been a wonderful person. What I haven't gone into in any great detail are the disappointments, because there have been, as we all have, disappointments. And we have to draw lessons from those as well. There are no pictures to accompany this bit, because that would be unfair. But I just wanted to describe one particularly difficult situation that I found myself in, and that was working with actually a chap who was a bit of a bully. And we parted ways in the end. And the advice, and it was very acrimonious, but the advice that I was given at the time by a friend was, when you've been bitten by a poisonous snake, the worst thing you can do is chase the snake, because you've still got the poison in you, and it will disappear. Get rid of the poison, the snake will die anyway. So my message, slightly less gory than poisonous snakes: this too will pass. Whenever you've got a disappointment, and you've got to learn from it, but the lesson you have to take away from it, this too will pass. For me, the issue has always been around excellence and standards, and I've always had an interest in that. And here are three things that I've produced. This one on your right was an article that was produced on nurses' ability to do mathematics, and it was a piece of research I did quite early on. The answer is not very well. And of course the issue is that if you get it wrong, you get it wrong by a factor of 10. You're either giving 10 times too much or a tenth of what is required. This was an interesting, because this was published in the Nursing Times, I think it was 1992. And someone wrote to me to say, oh, how we laughed because we did this and you got one of them wrong. So this expert had done, and then, so I was in the process, because before the days of email, I was in the process of writing back to them when I got another letter to say, oops, she understood how she now had made that mistake. And it was a great lesson for her, because actually what she needed to do was to go back over her work and think about whether or not, was it right, was it wrong? She just automatically assumed it was wrong. And one of the debates at the time was, should nurses be using calculators to work out? We had this debate in schools. Should pupils be allowed to do the maths exam with a calculator? We're having the same debate now with ChatGPT, aren't we? But anyway, that's different. These other two publications, one around clinical governance, which was all around standards. That was a monograph that I wrote for the Nursing Times. And this was my PhD, which was finished in 2004. And that was all about how clinical incidents involving qualified nurses were managed, what lessons were learned, what could we draw from them. So, in conclusion, 6 lessons. Recognise that you're leading even when you're not in a leadership post. Every day is a school day. Learn lessons, don't just identify them. Networks are important. Have your Napoleons, Corporal, and leave your crown in the garage. be part of the core purpose and live the values of the organisation. For all those disappointments, this too will pass, and excellence and standards, rarely if ever, is good enough. Good enough. But there's a seventh lesson, and that's about trust. I told you were going to have to come back to this. This bit of paper, when you picked it up, was pristine, absolutely pristine. And I'm going to use the metaphor of trust. We trust to begin with pristine. And then sometimes trust gets crumpled. Now try and restore this piece of paper to its former glory. It's just not the same, is it? It's just not the same. So the metaphor here is, can trust ever be the same? And trust in leadership is probably one of the key values, without any shadow of a doubt. And one of the things that I wanted to raise was, what does that do in relation to value? Because if you now take this bit of paper and imagine it's not a bit of paper, but a £20 note that you then crumpled up and then unravelled, it still has a value of £20. So where does trust and value coincide? The philosophers will tell you one thing, the sociologists will tell you something different, and I suspect the psychologists will tell you something yet different again. And for me, this is the individualization, if you like, of leadership, where you think trust and value collide. All of those things are really important, but without trust and without value, they can all be undermined in a particular way. So certainly worth thinking about, and thinking about it from that individual perspective, because then will we begin to think about both the art and the science of leadership. No lecture would be complete without a reading list, so do take a note, and I shall be asking questions, and I thank you for your patience. Thank you. There was lots of rapid tapping of watches at the back, so my apologies for rushing on a little there. But there is some time for questions. I'm very happy to take questions. There will be some roving mics, so if you wouldn't mind waiting until you get that before you ask your question. And given that not everybody will know everybody else, if you wouldn't mind just saying who you are before you ask the question. Don't be shy. Can't believe there's no questions. Chris. By the way, happy birthday, Chris. Can we congratulate Chris on his birthday?
Chris O'Donnell, and I think I am actually Napoleon's corporal after that piece there. I've just had a sudden realisation, but I am a member of staff here at UWS and a psychologist by practice. Principal, one of the things that you spoke to there in Heffernan's work is in the accountability of management to admit in leadership that they've made a mistake. And one of the blind spots is in not enacting the power that you have to say, we got it wrong. At what point does a emotionally intelligent leader admit that they got it wrong to ensure the value, the culture, the trust in the organisation?
Well, of course, the answer to that is as soon as possible, in order that you minimise the impact of that. Now, sometimes that's an extremely difficult thing to do when you're in the middle of it, which is why you need your Napoleon's corporals to tell you exactly what is going on. And yes, you are one of those individuals, because you never have any problem telling us when things are not going well, which is one of your great strengths, Chris. But the reason why I think many don't is because what should be an accountability culture is a blame culture. And where a blame culture has been allowed to develop, people will not then think about things and say, it's okay to say, I got it wrong, and this is how I've put it right. So getting rid of a blame culture, but maintaining an accountability culture and leading by example, I think is the way to do that. But as soon as possible is really the answer to it. Sometimes difficult to see that. Do you want to come back at me on that? No.
Jim, thank you very much. Fascinating. I've learned things about you this evening that I haven't known, and I've known you for a very long time. My name's Neil Kelly. I'm a general practitioner to trade. Early in your talk this evening, you alluded to the idea that when you were doing your training, it was very much an apprenticeship model. You were an employee of the health board, and that gave you an incredibly practical grounding. Many of you will be well aware that we have a significant manpower crisis in health and care at the moment. And I wonder whether actually we should be going back to looking at the idea of apprenticeship models and training being done in a much more practical way than it has been perhaps over the last 10 years.
I think the answer to that is yes. What we cannot lose in all of that, however, is the graduateness of graduate nurses. Because when I finished that 3-year programme, I remember very vividly, it was probably the very last day of being in the college block. The postgraduate tutor came in, and the thing she said was, well, you've just completed the Mickey Mouse Guide to Nursing. We were all outraged by that. But actually, when we began to look at the theory of nursing and other aspects of it that we then subsequently developed, she was, of course, right. There was more that could be learned. So I think what happened was we went from that apprenticeship model to the university-based model, and the pendulum probably swung a little too far, and there is some scope to bring it back. And the bringing it back is to make sure that we have that graduateness that's a part of it, but very much contained within the clinical practice in the field. I mean, at the moment, the number of hours of theory to practice is exactly right down the middle, and that's dictated by the NMC, the governing body. But that's not really helping the workforce issue, which is really the issue that I think now needs to be addressed. And actually, I think from an economic perspective, the economics round about it might be actually better than people would immediately think. So, yeah. Just there.
Hi, Paul Sheeran from Scottish Engineering. So before I ask my maybe somewhat disagreeable question, I just want to say I really enjoyed the lecture. I think it underlined for me that the place for a lecture is certainly not dead. I really enjoyed that. Thanks for it. So I suppose I was nodding my way through just about everything. The one that I stopped at was the close enough is good enough. And I suppose in our industry, we've very much become advocates of a kind of lean philosophy where the idea of once you're close enough, let's go, and then let's make it better. And so maybe I'd like to hear your thought on the balance between that. And there are situations where close enough isn't good enough to go, but there's a lot of situations where we need to start quickly and make better as we go. Thanks.
Yeah, I suppose I differentiate this slightly, but you're absolutely right. A lot will depend on the circumstances. When I used to do a little bit of workshops around quality, and we talked about should it be 100% every single time. One of the anecdotes I used to say was, well, if you got into a flight to go to Malaga and you said, and over the tannoy came the captain saying, well, welcome to your flight, there's about an 80% chance we're going to get there. That's not going to be acceptable. So it very much does depend on the circumstances. Where I think you are referring to, I would judge that as you've got a certain amount of data, you've got a certain end point, and at some point you have to make a judgment as to whether or not that is the time to move or not. And what I worry about slightly is that we're losing the art of judgment. And if we make the judgment and it's right, everything is fine. If we make the judgment and it doesn't turn out right, then you fail fast, you fail fast, and then you go back to the drawing board. So it's very situational is the way that I would describe it. But one is about understanding that actually some things must be 100%, and there are others where you make a judgment as to whether or not and it's all about risk and management, and you can put all sorts of really interesting words around it, and we could play bingo with all of that this evening if you really wanted to. But for me, it's two different sets of circumstances. But when you know that it's not going well, then fail fast. And the issue then goes back to the point that we were making earlier, which is that's much easier to do when you don't have a blame culture. When you have a blame culture in the organisation, things go wrong. And the health service had much to learn from what happened in the airline industry around the use of checklists and all sorts of things to reduce mistakes that happened. So learning from other industries is a really important part of that. And if we had another hour, I could give you a whole lecture on the parallels between the sinking of the Titanic and the NHS. I could probably do the same for universities as well, but that's a bit too close to home at the moment. It kind of feels as if that's a bit too tight.
Hi, Wendy, one of the lecturers up here at Paisley in the Health and Life Sciences. We're talking about apprenticeships. I actually was working down in London where we had the trainee nursing associate apprentices started back in 2019, and it's now gone on to 4-year degree apprenticeships for nurses, so they can go directly in, or they can do a 2+2, so they do 2 years of trainee nursing associate, potentially a year preceptorship, and then 2 years as a nursing degree apprenticeship. So it is there is models there. So I don't know what the situation is up in Scotland, whether that's something that would come up, because obviously it was all related around the trainee nursing associate, which isn't a role up in Scotland.
So there are some models like that. The Open University runs a very similar apprenticeship model, not quite the same as it's done in England, but there are some other models around. But it does require, I think, a fundamental rethink around how the training is done, and you need the regulator on board to be able to do that. And for some people, that's just a step too far, quite frankly. But I think, as is often the case, what will precipitate this is a major issue. And it does feel at the moment as if we're not too far away from it. The First Minister was on television just the other night, I gather. I didn't see it, but somebody else was telling me about it, about the crisis in the nursing workforce. So we're very close to making sure that we need to do something different. And unfortunately, the answer, which is often comes up from politicians, is, well, we just need to train more nurses. Well, it takes 3 or 4 years to train more nurses. That doesn't get them into the workforce delivering what you need to deliver.
I think the other thing as well is the issue around, certainly down in England, is that if it's employees who are away, there is no backfill, because it's worked on the same principle as all other apprenticeships, so there is no backfill when they're away, especially when they're on the degree pathway.
Yeah.
To cover the placements when they're away from placement or when they're in university.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Johnny.
Johnny Moan, I too am work here at UWS, leading business innovation. James, thanks very much for sharing your journey. It's given us all a great insight into the various stages, and very, very interesting, and thank you for sharing it. To lead is to be on a journey. I'm thinking about shepherds who walk ahead of their sheep and they follow. What are your hopes for the journey that you'll be on with us here at UWS?
Oh, interesting question. Well, UWS is unique in Scotland. It has a unique opportunity to really ensure that it is a change maker from a place perspective. We have 4 campuses in Scotland. We have one in London as well. So if we were to think about the impact that we have in those places, not just as towns, but as regions, and then nationally and globally as well, then the opportunities that we can make a difference to those communities, locally, nationally and internationally, through the work that we've just talked about in terms of the SDGs, for example, that's where I want to see the university really thriving. And we will do that through the amazing students that Lucy mentioned earlier on, because they are the future leaders, they are the change makers of the future, and we'll do that with the incredible staff that we have as well, not only from a learning and teaching perspective, but also from a research, and making sure that the research that we are undertaking here feeds into that curriculum. But it's well beyond the disciplines, and it's well beyond the subject matter that the students come to develop here. It's about all the soft skills that they develop as well. And that's not just about the employability, which most universities will talk about, but what role will they ultimately take up in society as leaders, as entrepreneurs in business and social entrepreneurs. So how do we make that those future leaders from the students who come here? We're unique also in the demography of our students, because unlike some other universities, we are not dominated by 17 and 18-year-olds who come out of school and progress into university. We've got a high proportion of mature students. We've got the highest proportion in Scotland of students who come from the most deprived areas in Scotland, and they require lots of additional support to make sure that they are comfortable, not just in their learning and teaching, but in the pastoral care that is required as a wraparound for that as well. And if we can make that difference so that they can make that difference, then their communities, Scotland, and ultimately the world will be a much better place. That sounds all a bit grand, but absolutely we can do it. We've got a 2025 strategy. We'll see that through to the end, and then by the time we're finished that, we will have developed our new strategy for 2030, because the world that we are going to be living in by the time we get to that point is a very different world from the world that we developed our earlier strategy in. So it does need that new vision, new approach. Matt.
Thank you very much, Matt Lamb. I've got a question about the student. So education obviously has changed, the student engagement has changed, the student journey has changed. And I kind of wanted to ask you your thoughts on, if you were to say to a student that graduates when your graduation is this year, and there are 3 things to be that leader from this journey they've went on through a challenging time, through their degree, through the COVID pandemic, what would they 3 things be? What's the roots that they really need to stand upon to then do UWS proud, to do their place that they've came from proud, and themselves proud? What were the 3 things from a student point of view on their journey?
So when you came in, you will have seen lots of things, not just me, but lots of bits about the university. And there are 3 words out there that are often seen as part of the university: dream, believe, achieve. And these would be the 3 things that I would get them to think about. And when I was being introduced to the university in my inauguration, I finished it by saying, by invoking Martin Luther King Jr., who, when he gave his iconic speech, he said, "I have a dream." He never said, "I have a plan." So my advice to them would be, have the dream, believe in the dream, achieve the dream, and you will make it. I suspect this is probably going to have to be the last question, but I am going to be around over drinks, because by golly, I need one. And if you want to catch me then please do. John.
John Struthers at the university here. Thank you for a most stimulating presentation, James. I was thinking of 2 elements of leadership that you didn't mention. One is visibility, and the other one is teamwork. Now, you did touch a little bit on the teamwork element when you spoke about Napoleon's corporal, but I think a leader needs more than one corporal. You need several corporals, especially in your own position. Yeah. But also in terms of visibility, and I know you said you knew nothing about football when you met Sir Alex Ferguson. Is the manager more important than the players in the team? Now, I know you like golf. I suppose the golf equivalent of this is the Ryder Cup more important than winning the Open?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yeah, for me, it's always about team, and I really ought to have spent a little longer talking about Paul Taylor and his approach to visibility, which was to be seen out and about, and it's certainly something that I'm very strong on. You will all know the folks that are part of the university, the number of times I'm out, the number of times I'm in front of a camera, encouraging people to ask questions. So I think visibility is really important, and that's I think physical visibility is an important part of that, not just the visibility that we have become used to over the pandemic, which is a bit two-dimensional, but three-dimensional visibility is absolutely essential. And for me, I think the bigger prize is the Ryder Cup, without a doubt. And if I were to draw a comparison, if you watch, those of you who are interested, if you watch the UK and Europe functioning as a team, they usually function as a team. The US function as a group of individuals, and that's the difference. And in the team that we've got, the executive team that we've got here at UWS, which is a fantastic team, there are two things that in particular I've emphasised to them. One is around matrix working, so you don't need to have somebody reporting to you. They're sick to the back teeth of hearing this, but I'm going to say it anyway. So matrix working is really important. And the second thing is collective responsibility and accountability. And these can only be achieved if you've got a fully functioning team. I wouldn't mind winning the Open. Okay, I think we have to leave it there, and can I thank you all once again for, first of all, coming along, secondly, for listening, and thirdly, for the questions that you presented. So, hand you over to the Chancellor.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Yekemi Otaru, and I'm very proud to be the Chancellor of this wonderful university. I am delighted that the lecture isn't dead and that it's alive and well, very much alive and well in James. Thank you very much for sharing your leadership lessons with us. If you know anything about me, you might know that I'm a marketer at heart. So as James was going through his leadership lessons, I started trying to create some alliterations around that so that you can remember it as you go about the rest of your day. So he spoke about recognizing when you're a leader, and I thought, oh, that is acknowledgement, acknowledging that you're a leader. Acknowledgement starts with A. Then I thought, ooh, every day is a school day. Oh, he spoke about not just identifying lessons, but actually learning from those and applying those. And I thought, oh, assimilating. Because when you assimilate, you not only learn and identify, but you also apply it. And then when he got to the third point around the importance of networks, I thought, this one's getting a bit difficult. But I thought associations, because he had so many stories around the different associations throughout his leadership journey, throughout his career. And then he got to core purpose and values, and that was really tough. I thought, he's not making it easy for me to come up with these A's. But I still tried, and I came up with anchors, your anchors and the things that guide you, like your North Star. So anchors. And then when he came to number 6, these two will pass. I thought, this is really difficult. I suppose the antagonists along the way, don't allow that hold you down, and know that you're going to go past this stage.
And then he spoke about excellence and standards, and I thought, yeah, this is about aspiring to that A-grade quality, to always want to do better and always want to put out the absolutely best quality of work that you can. So when he got to number 7, I got stuck because that was trust. And if anyone has any ideas of anything that starts with A that might replace trust, let me know. But for this evening, I'll leave you with acknowledgement, assimilating your associations, anchors, and aspiring for that A-grade quality. And the outlier there, trust, which is absolutely important. Thank you very much, and please join us at the drinks reception. James will definitely be there hovering around the drinks. Thank you and good evening.